Known as La Malinche, Malintzin, or Donna Marina, Hernan Cortez's chief interpreter and lover played an enormous role in shaping Spanish relations with her native peoples. This video will analyse Malintzin's role as a go-between and how and why she was so important to not just Native American, but also global history. We will be covering three main areas of conversation throughout this video. First of all, we will cover Malintzin's effectiveness as a go-between and how her role as a go-between affected her life. Secondly, we will look at her approach to her role. Was she self-serving, or did she prioritise the frictionless exchange of ideas between her native peoples and the Spanish invaders? And finally, we'll be analysing how Malintzin's example can be used to better understand other go-betweens and their history. Before we begin, it is essential to define what we mean by a go-between. For the purposes of this video, a go-between will be defined as someone who aims to help neutralise disparities between cultures to reduce friction and ensure the flow of exchanging ideas and goods. In this case, Malintzin helped to bridge linguistic and cultural barriers to assist interactions between indigenous Americans and Spanish conquistadors. So, how did her position enable Malintzin to be such an effective go-between? Well, Malintzin was a Mexican native woman born just before the year 1500, somewhere on the Yucatan Peninsula. She was one of 20 women slaves given to the Spaniards by the natives of Tabasco in 1519. In her early life, Malintzin was handed from her parents to the Chicalango people, and then on to the Tabascans, who eventually gave her to the Spanish when she was around 20 years old, after being defeated by them in battle. She was singled out as particularly beautiful, and Cortez kept her as an interpreter because she spoke two native languages, Mayan and Nahuatl. Malintzin was one of the first natives to speak Spanish, which she learned having spent 20 years growing up with different native groups. She was in a unique position because no Native Americans had ever had the chance to learn Spanish before they arrived in Mexico, so it was an entirely new experience. She also went on to have Hernan Cortez's first son, Martin Cortez. Martin is often considered one of, if not the first mestizo, people of mixed indigenous American and European ancestry. Malintzin's background enabled her to be such an effective go-between because she'd had a deep understanding of her native culture, as well as speaking Spanish and integrating herself extremely well with the Spanish invaders. She was the first Native American to integrate herself to that extent, which gives her a unique position in history. This moves us on to the question of how effective Malintzin was as a go-between. Now, effectiveness as a go-between is twofold. There's the ability to protect the individual go-between, and an ability to promote frictionless relations between the two opposing forces. For go-betweens, protecting themselves can be a very difficult task. Alida Metcalf points to the ease with which go-betweens could become anonymous afterthoughts of a clash between empires. For example, when Francisco Pizarro met the Inca Atahualpa at Cajamarca in 1532, it is presented as a dyadic clash of empires rather than triadic. The role of the interpreter is often ignored. Malintzin's ability to promote her own image indicates she was a significant person in Mexican and Spanish culture, and was therefore successful in at least protecting herself. As you will have seen in the images on screen, Malintzin often takes the position of prominence in artwork. Hernan Cortez is rarely portrayed without Malintzin nearby, but she is sometimes portrayed alone, and this shows the respect that she gained as an effective go-between. As William Brandon wrote in his 2003 book, The Rise and Fall of North American Indians, some people are almost tempted to think of her as the real conqueror of Mexico. However, she was also successful in promoting frictionless relations between the Spaniards and the Indians. Conquistadors were particularly impressed by her ability to persuade the indigenous people that resistance was futile, thus smoothing the Spaniards' path to power and making controlling the native peoples far easier. She was a brilliant translator for Cortez, as she furthered his interests very effectively. However, this was not necessarily true for the indigenous people. Malintzin was aware that her entire position relied on Cortez and the Spanish, and therefore she invested herself heavily in promoting Spanish interests over and above those of her native people. This has led to her being victimized in much past historiography as betraying her people. But this leads us to question, who was she betraying? Modern-day indigenous people from Mexico have often criticised her for betraying her indigenous roots, but this is a strong claim to make against someone whose people gave her away to foreign invaders, and she was passed around several native groups as a child. It is perhaps unfair to expect her to have any sense of native identity when she never spent more than a few years with a particular native group. She spent far longer with the Spanish than she did with any individual indigenous group.
So was Malintzin a self-serving arbitrator or a neutral mediator, and how does this impact her historical importance as a go-between? To answer this question, we must first note the structure which has been used to define historical interpretations of go-betweens. It has long been assumed that the relationship between Europe and the Americas has been dyadic or opposing. The study of go-betweens, such as Malintzin, suggests that this was not the case, and that there is a key difference between dyadic and triadic relationships. Alida Metcalfe's Go-Betweens and the Colonization of Brazil from 1500 to 1600 cites the work of sociologist George Simmel, who explains that the structure of the triad consists of isolated elements which are unified by their common relationship to a phenomenon which lives outside of them. Instead of there simply being two entities in conflict, there is a third party, or a go-between, who creates common ground for opposing parties in their interactions. According to Simmel, within this triad, the go-between can take the form of either a mediator or an arbitrator. The mediator is someone who guides the process of coming to terms, and the arbitrator ends up taking sides. For Simmel, mediators allow the two parties to determine the outcome of their conflict, whereas when the two sides choose an arbitrator, their will to conciliation is personified in the arbitrator. When we apply these parameters to Malintzin, the image becomes increasingly complex. When trying to define Malintzin's role, one of the key challenges faced is the lack of any personal accounts or journals. All the information that we know about her life is gathered from the accounts of those who surrounded her, meaning her motivations have to be deciphered from a number of sources. One such source is the Codex Florentino, which emphasizes the role of Malintzin in its drawings and in its Spanish and Nahuatl texts. This particular image from the Codex shows Malintzin standing between the Spanish and Indian sides, clearly conveying an encounter that was not exclusively a dyadic relationship between the Spaniards and Moctezuma, but one that was facilitated by a third party, Malintzin, through whom words were passing. One could argue that based on the image's portrayal of Malintzin, who is placed in the middle of the illustration seemingly as an independent entity, is acting simply as a mediator and interpreter. However, one cannot rely purely on illustrative works to draw conclusions. Further analysis from the likes of Camilla Townsend suggests that Malintzin may have been more opportunistic in her position, first using it as a vehicle of survival, and then as an opportunity to cement her position and thrive as she became increasingly important in the conquest of Mexican territories. For example, Malintzin's marriage to Juan Jaramillo, a Spanish hidalgo, which was a position of lower nobility, can be interpreted as a seizing of power to better the lives of both herself and her children. In this way, she worked not as a mediator, but as someone invested heavily in her own well-being. Her position as arbitrator is illustrated best by the Aztec accounts of the conquest of Mexico. When Cortes entered the city of Tenochtitlan, Malintzin played a central role in the exploitation of the native peoples by issuing orders on behalf of Cortes to hand over provisions, and aided the Spanish further as they pillaged the city of all its gold and gemstones. This situation shows Malintzin's motivation to bring success to the Spaniards, and perhaps reflects the one-sidedness of her position. Forced by circumstance, and adjusting positions when opportunities arose, Malintzin's actions must be viewed on a case-by-case basis, as is the difficulty of dealing with such liminal individuals. This raises a number of key predicaments from a historiographical perspective.
What does the example of Malintzin teach us about the predicament of go-betweens in history? Malintzin's position as a go-between was very precarious, and it had a complex relationship with her identity. As a woman, she was both vulnerable to the whims of powerful men, whilst also being uniquely suited to her position as a mediator, because of the prevailing European stereotype that women were weak and harmless, and therefore she was no threat to the people that she was negotiating with. It was because of her femininity that she attracted the attention of Hernan Cortes, and as his concubine was entirely dependent on him for survival and social advancement. Though he had a child by her, it was clear that she remained by his side because of her usefulness, rather than because there was any genuine romantic feeling between the two. Malintzin's ability as a translator was the reason Cortes brought her into many dangerous situations, and it was a real possibility that she could die on campaign, either due to disease or violence on part of the enemies of the Spanish. Though the favour of Cortes protected her from suspicion by his Spanish countrymen, if his displeasure was incurred, this protection would quickly disappear, Many go-betweens likely suffered this fate of being made into a convenient scapegoat, but Malintzin is one of the recorded exceptions. Due to her knowledge of the locality and willingness to cooperate, she never really outlived her usefulness. We can draw a direct comparison of this with the South African translator Eva as to what Malintzin's fate could have been if events transpired differently. Eva's husband no longer had any use for her as a mediator, and so she was left without means to take care of her children and slipped into poverty and alcoholism. As Malintzin's relationship with Cortez came to its close, she made plans for her own future and managed to secure herself a husband as well as land of her own that put herself in a much more stable position than could possibly have been expected of a Mexican slave girl. It is possible La Malinche only escaped the fate of Eva because she died at a very young age, but it is nonetheless interesting to note that she is one of history's only examples of a successful female mediator, overcoming the very delicate situation that she was placed in to survive and even prosper from the arrangement that she made with the Spanish. However, her collaboration with the Spanish is largely frowned upon in Mexican historical tradition and earned her the hatred of future generations. Like other examples of successful go-betweens, Malintzin had to consciously adopt Spanish culture as her own, taking the Christian name of Donna Marina and eventually marrying a Spaniard captain in order to secure the future of herself and her children. In the national narrative of Mexico, this marks Malintzin out as a traitor and collaborator, and though she is regarded as the mother of the nation, this concept is coupled with her betraying Mexico to a foreign conqueror that kept her subjugated for many years. Though this is an anachronistic viewpoint that ignores the complex relationships between the different Central American peoples, it remains a powerful part of the national myth even today. This story of the national traitor epitomizes the popular attitude towards go-betweens of mistrust and even disdain from both sides for their willingness to cross boundaries and cooperate with alien cultures. The word Malinchista is used today still as an insult to Mexicans that have adopted foreign cultural habits, and is the unfortunate legacy of a woman who only wanted to survive by any means necessary.